citadel that you see over there where the mosque is, the Ottoman looking mosque. And I just want you to take note of the Mu'attam hill on your right. That little outcrop, that's the most we can, that's the highest we have in terms of hills. We're not very hilly. I'll be showing you some maps when we stop. I also want you to take note of bridges and roads. Roads that are at points very narrow and at points extremely wide in ways that are quite suspicious and that are obviously related to the modern development of the city. Now, a bridge such as the one we're going on right now, the bridge of Sayyida Aisha, this is a bridge that was created in the 1970s in order to accommodate two highways that were established in the city. Salah Salim Highway, which we're on, which is a north-south highway that veers towards the west where we are right now. And the other highway is parallel to that one. It's called the Autostrade. And what I'm going to show you on, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but further down, look out for a small little gate, a small little stone gate. That is, there are two stone gates, two Bab al-Arafas. Al-Arafa means the cemetery. They were two gates that were built one after the other that signify the end, the southern end, the extremity of the city and the beginning of the cemetery. Now note that some of the cemetery lies inside the city, but this was a wall that was created after the creation of the cemetery. Okay, here's one gate. Do you see it? That small little arch way over there on the right, where the people are having their shisha. And here's the other one. This is a later one. The first one is Ayyubids from the 12th century. The other one is from the late 15th century. What interests me is this one, the one from the late 15th century, because when the bridge was built, they dismantled it and moved it to widen the street to allow for to make room for the bridge. And this is one of the strategies that we're going to talk about today, the strategy of trying to accommodate the new demands of the city with the existing older city. So, do you demolish or do you move? And if you move, what does that do to the urban fabric of the city? How much can you conserve? How much do you have to let go of? These are all questions. And, enters into a space that has a mosque and has a number of other things, but it's called in the sources the cistern of Manjak. So the most important thing about it is that it has a cistern. This is the Hod of Abdurrahman Kat Khoda, and down there is another, both Sabil, so it's a place for the dispensation of water both to people and to animals. So we're going to walk down. I want you to think about why there would be three huge, not huge, but main structures for the dispensation of water so close to each other. Okay, we'll walk. Why do you think we have three structures, and actually more, we know of 10 in this area, for the charitable dispensation of water, so close to each other in one location? Centers of what?
From which water was then distributed.
No. Huh, what else? Where are we? Do you know where we are? Yes, we're in the cemetery. Normally cemeteries would be inside or outside the city? Outside the city. So right now we are outside the Islamic city of Cairo. Now, you would need to be entering from somewhere where you had been traveling for a while, where you've run out of water, and you are met in a place that allows you to take water to continue your travel. Okay, those of you who are from Cairo, where do you think they came from? The people who were traveling from so far in the north, they came this way and they came around and they entered the city either through the gate that we're going to go to or down the road where we were. Where do you think they were coming from? Exactly, from pilgrimage. So the theme in this area is definitely pilgrimage, okay? You have, this is one of the junctions of the city where travelers would come. The mahmal, the kiswa, the cover of the Mecca cover procession would go down this street, and people, when they're coming, they would arrive by this street and they would find a number of places where they can get the water that is badly needed. This is one thing that we need to know. The other thing that we need to know is that at a certain point in history, at the end of the 15th century, at the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century, a large number of Mamluk funerary domes were built in this location. They belonged mostly to very high-ranking commanders and princes of the Mamluk order. Those of you who don't know, the Mamluk period is a period that starts in 1250 and ends in 1517, and it's a class of not mercenaries, but former slaves who ruled Egypt. So why do you think they would come here to build their domes? Why would they choose this particular cemetery to come and build their domes? Why would it become so popular, do you think? Look up. Over there. What's over there? Cairo people. The citadel, exactly. So, one of the things that they were very careful about was to build their domes in a place where it could be seen in the citadel, which is the center of rule. Now, I'm mentioning this for a reason. I'm mentioning this because this is a very different take on cemeteries than we have today. Today, as you noticed when we were driving down the street, we build walls to hide cemeteries. At that time, cemeteries were put in prime locations, and this is something that we will find out when we go around, because they were seen as a sign of religiosity, as a sign of piety, and Mamluks built them. They were very ostentatious and huge structures, the tombs themselves, and they were also structures for charity. They were establishments of education and teaching itself. Okay, what we're going to do now is going to walk down the cemetery. This is one of the cemeteries. This is one of the least inhabited cemeteries of Cairo. But just look right and left, and we will stop at the city gate, which is Bab al-Wazir. The 19th century section of the city. Then we crossed the Nile. We came round and we came up. We didn't pass by Old Cairo, but we passed north of it. And right now we are here close to the citadel. We actually did the opposite of what the city did when it developed. The city developed this way, we've moved this way. Where are we in all of Cairo? This is the ring road. It's a 100-kilometer road that doesn't really encircle, it tries to encircle Greater Cairo, and we are here. Okay? Originally, over here, I can't see properly. Here, this was the old city, Fatimid Cairo, and it looked like this. Okay, those of you who know Ma'adi, very close to Ma'adi was the city of Fustat, which was the original settlement of the Muslims when they came, close to a tiny Christian settlement called Babylon. The city starts to move northward. The Fatimids come in the 10th century. They built a walled city, a small walled city, walls again, but it was more of like a walled palace, not a walled city. Egyptians themselves were not, at the beginning, were not allowed to stay overnight in this city. They could come in, they could serve the Fatimids, they could sell things, they could do whatever, and then they had to leave and go back south to Fustat. After some unrest and some problems and some economic issues, etc., the city fell into quite a bit of a decline, and then they started to develop it again, and only then were Egyptians allowed inside the city. And by then, but this was the beginning of the end of the Fatimids, 1171, the city is conquered by Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, Saladin, known for his fight and struggles against the Crusaders. Saladin comes from Syria, where you need two things in order to be a ruler. You need a citadel and you need a wall around your city. Not just a wall around your palace, which you call a city, an actual defensive wall around the city as a whole. So he proceeds to build his citadel over there where you saw it, and to encircle the city as a whole in this with a huge wall. This is not part of the wall, but it indicates where the gate into the city from the east was, and this is the gate of Aitmish al-Bagasi, and very close to Bab al-Wazir, where you enter the city. So right now we're outside the city, we're about to enter. The space that you see here, this is related to the conservation efforts of the Aga Khan founder, the Aga Khan Trust, And we're going into Darb al-Ahmar, which was the street of choice for the Aga Khan in the course of the last almost 20 years, where they first, a garden somewhere else won an Aga Khan prize. So tradition dictates that if a city wins an Aga Khan prize, the Aga Khan donates a sum of money for another establishment in the city. They decided to establish a park where we're going later today, Al-Azhar Park, which in a location that used to previously be a dump and had recently become a place where they constructed 4 big cisterns for water for the city of Cairo. When the Aga Khan decided to build the park, he was told, how are you going to put all this money into building a park that overlooks one of the poorest areas of Islamic Cairo, which is the area that we're going into right now, that you're not touching at all. So he said, okay, fine, let's also work on conservation. And thus began the Darb al-Ahmar project, which probably Karim will talk about more, or we will talk about more when we get to the park itself. What we're doing now is we're entering Darb al-Ahmar, and just take note of the kind of conservation work that's happening, and we will talk about it more. So one of the things that the Aga Khan do a lot is this kind of work, whether in collaboration with the community itself or through funding that they get, where they also intervene on the urban level. These are the borders of the original Fatimid walled city of Al-Qahira. And this is the citadel that Salah ad-Din established as his center of rule. And down there somewhere is Al-Fustat, the original settlement of Cairo. Over here, the south and north mostly of Al-Qahira were cemeteries again. But when the citadel was established here, this became a major thoroughfare. I mean, you needed to easily access the citadel from the city. And with that came the establishment of the Darb al-Ahmar in the Mamluk period, where they created this road, and of course it became a major road, prime property. It turned from cemetery to prime property because of its new location between the old center of rule and the new center of rule, the city center and the new center of rule. And this is a process that we see in Cairo all the time. The city grows, areas that were on the outskirts suddenly find themselves in the middle of the city. And in the case of Cairo, the biggest victim is always the cemetery, because outside most of the gates, there is always a cemetery. Now, I'm talking a lot about cemeteries because I study them, but we're going to stop talking about them as soon as we move out of here. The cemeteries of Cairo are a very specific case because they're not just places where you bury your dead, they are places where people live, they are places where immigrants can settle when they come, or refugees can settle where they come. There are places that have charitable establishments for education and for Sufism, etc., that are endowed with endowments. Muhammad Shaid was talking about them for their perpetuity. So it's like a wonderful source of livelihood, and that is why people settle there all the time. So those of you who know of the problem of the city of the dead, etc., just understand that it is not a new phenomenon that happened because the city, whatever. It is an old phenomenon that, as with the rest of the city, is showing wear and tear, because now it's a city that is accommodating way more people than it can accommodate. So as the cemetery is now accommodating way more people than it can accommodate. You will notice, like we passed by Tarabai Sharif, this is Ayat Mishal Bagasi, you will notice a number of Mamluk establishments along that road, again for the same reason, as they establish their tombs outside the walls. They establish, some of them choose to establish their charitable institutions within the city walls, close to the citadel, and on the road from the main center of rule, the original center of rule, and some choose to do so outside the city itself. Outside the mosque, you see that stone pillar? That is the beginning of a fence. So this idea of fencing off the monument. 3, the very different character, the difference in character between the main street and the side streets. Okay? One thing is noticeable, although not as much as this Hara, but in others, the side streets are way cleaner than the main streets. The side streets are places that have a neighborhood feel, that people consider sort of like their living rooms almost. They take care of them, they clean them. They used to have a competition for the cleanest Hara. There's one Hara here called the clean Hara, the clean alley. And it's always clean. They're proud of the fact that they keep it clean. Now the main street is another problem. It is perceived as the responsibility of the government. And the government accentuates this perception by asking people to stay away from the monuments and not to intervene in any way, and making them feel that the street here is not yours. Obviously, the people still use the street a lot, but there isn't the same sense of responsibility for keeping it clean as you have inside. Places that don't have an owner immediately become dumps. And it's not that people are not very clean, but that's not the issue. The issue is that you have to put your garbage in a place for the garbage collector to pick it up. So where would be the garbage collection points? They will be in places where there is nobody to protest against the fact that you're putting a huge pile of garbage in front of my shop or in front of my home. So it's either a disused shop such as this one, or the easiest of solutions, the monument, in front of the monument. And the fact that the monument is, that the buildings around the monument are cleared, the fact that there is a fence, it makes it, like, morphologically the perfect location for you to dump your garbage easily. And so this strategy of disassociating the monument from the urban fabric actually is harmful to the monument, because immediately it becomes a no man's land that people can use for whatever unfavorable activity they want to do, and there's no one to protest. Around these monuments, obviously this is a living city. It has a very vibrant community. It has activities both in the sense of trade and also small workshops. And it has a community. It's not just that the people live here, it's that people live here and they are part of a community. I think this is an interesting spot because it shows you a number of different kinds of buildings. These are the turn of the century buildings, either inspired by Islamic architecture or maybe inspired by, it's sort of like your neutral Italianate style that has no clear design. Sometimes you have buildings inspired by Art Nouveau or neoclassical architecture. And then these are your new buildings. Then you have the buildings from the 70s, such as this one, or the 80s or the 90s. And then you have the buildings that started to appear after there was a decree that limited the height of buildings within Islamic Cairo to a ground floor plus 3 or 4, depending on the location, and also said that the style has to be Islamic or historical, whatever that means. So this was interpreted as beige, arches, ugly. Okay? And obviously this is not Islamic, but I'll show you a number of examples. Now, this is a new building, this is a new building. This one follows the height restrictions, this one doesn't. But this one is a very, very nice and decent example of a situation that has started to happen after the revolution, where, taking advantage of the security problems, people are building 10 and 12-story buildings in the middle of the city. And you're going to see that when we get to Al-Azhar Park. And this was the work of a professor in Azhar University called Professor Salah Zaki, and he actually involved his students in the work. And they did studies of the typologies of the buildings and worked with the people and did like a co-funding thing where the people paid part of the money and he got funding for the rest. This was before the Azhar. Those of you who are interested in architecture, this is the house where Hassan Fathi lived for years and years. This is Beit al-Fan. A house that he had bought and restored, and he lived. And this is where Hassan Fathi is like the only world famous Egyptian architect, and he built in mud brick, and he was an advocate of a vernacular style of architecture that was inspired by Nubian architecture. And this is where a lot of the people who are maybe in their 60s and 70s now have memories of coming to the home, to Hassan Bey, as they called him, who was to quote from yesterday, a benevolent dictator who abused them all soundly, but they all loved him for it. God knows why. The square has a really interesting history. It was always a square. It was actually two squares. In front of this is the citadel, as we agreed. In front of the citadel, there was Midan al-Rumaila, where you had military parades, etc. And it was open to the public. On the right, I wanted us to come through that path, but the bus refused. There was another Midan called Qara Midan. Okay, now this is a Rumaila, and this is Qaramidan, this is the citadel, and this is where we are now. Qaramidan was also a long Midan, a very long Midan for military parades, but the thing that most people don't know is that it was a Midan that had a wall and that had gates that were locked. You were only allowed in special occasions, okay? And from the word Qaramidan now in Egyptian colloquial means prison, and this is because I can't remember the date. At some point, part of it, right next to it, there was a prison, a very famous prison that was associated to another infamous prison in the citadel itself. After the revolution, and also before, but after the revolution, it was famous for the torture of political activists at the time over there. And the citadel still now has a very strong police, and it used to be a military presence. It is still perceived as like a military vantage point for there. What I want to talk about here is something else. Now, as you see, this is a wonderful space. It's people use it, they love to come and they sit here and there's a breeze, and there is always this fight between the antiquities and the people about who's allowed in, who's allowed out, what people are allowed to do in this space. It used to be that they opened both gates, the eastern gate and the western gate at the bottom. Now they only have one gate open, where we have called ahead to get them to open the other gate for us, to discourage people from using the space. The woman who was like doing this and doing that, it was in protest against us entering, but also because of the people picnicking. She thinks that this is like something that is shameful. Sultan Hassan has a very strong a community of people who come and pray there regularly, and there was always a fight between the residents and the antiquities about how they are allowed to use the mosque, how long the mosque is open, because the open closes at certain times, and they are always fighting for the mosque to be open day and night, because a lot of people come to actually pray all night in the mosque. It happens in Ramadan now, but and this was considered as a major victory for the residents themselves. But this space wasn't always like this. Now, this is what it originally looked like in the 19th century. This is Sultan Hassan, and in front of it, as you can see, no mosque. So the Mosque of al-Rifa'i was built in the early 20th century. It is called al-Rifa'i after a very famous Sufi saint whose shrine is at the back of the mosque. It was built by the ruling family, the royal family, and a lot of the tombs of the royal family, including the last king Farouk, are inside the mosque itself. But the interesting thing about it, it has a number of interesting things. First of all, the design, and a lot of the Egyptians, they come here and they say, oh my God, a cross on a mosque. Huh? You can see the design of the windows. This was designed by Hertz Bey, who was an Austrian architect who worked a lot in the conservation. He was the head of the Comité de Conservation. And the design is a mix of Islamic and Gothic. And so some of the details to Egyptians seem a bit strange. The second important thing in my eye is the fact that the shrine of al-Rifa'i is relegated to a less important position. That people still come today, villagers, etc. They come to visit the shrine of Rifa'i. Now, people like us come to visit the tomb of the Malik Farouk, or the King Farouk, or the King whatever. So this is another issue that I think is important, this idea of who uses the monument for what. And when you conserve or when you work, whose rights are you elevating in importance, and whose rights are you actually diminishing in importance? And now it's been the case, the strategy for years and years, that you always think about the foreigner, you always think about the cultural tourist. This is another image from David Roberts of the same place. And the local use is always given, maybe not even given importance. With the result that we see now, that the moment there is no tourism, these places are just deserted. If there are places where the original memory of important things, such as, I suppose, such as a shrine or an important king or local myths or whatever, it remains, people continue to come to the place. But places where this has been lost, تعرف ده فين؟ برافو عليك. Huh? They are totally abandoned. Another important question, I think, is this layers of meaning in terms of the importance of the places. Yani for me, as a 40-something who was born in Cairo, the space as it is now is a very important part of the heritage. This is not an original situation. This is the space was never like this. I mean, originally it was never like this. It has been like this for 100 years. So if somebody were to come today and to say, let me try and reconstruct the original aspect of the space, obviously not tearing down repair, but what if this was possible? For me, this would be a problem, because I think heritage is also related to memories that are immediate. And this idea of reconciling the immediate with the older and the older and the older, and finding out the meanings, the layers of meanings is very important. Some people wanted to go to the loo, to the bathrooms. So I think there's a toilet here. So we stop here for 5 minutes, just come back quickly. Establishment of Sultan Hassan. This was a huge establishment that had a school, it had accommodation for the students who studied there, it had kitchens, sorry? No? A mill, yes. Yes, a mill, it was a whole mini community. I think what's interesting about here is in a city like Cairo, what to do with what is below the ground. Anywhere you dig in Islamic Cairo, there will be something, okay? And in a lot of cases, we've had fights sometimes that I felt were not really necessary about trying to preserve excavations. But then if you preserve the excavations, what happens? Like in this case, if it's a park, meshi. But we have the example of the excavation ground of Fustat, which is like very, very important excavations because they are the oldest remains we have of the old city of Fustat, some dating from the 10th century, but it's a garbage dump again, and it's very difficult to protect. And now there is talk all the time of people trying to encroach upon it. So again, this idea of whether or not to excavate, maybe you shouldn't excavate, or you should excavate and you should just close up completely and preserve what you have, just preserve the information and preserve whatever you need to preserve below ground. But then what if somebody builds? And what happens with foundations? So it's really, and this is one of the questions that for me are very difficult to answer. Going to go down the street to the point where it intersects with the main street, or the original main street of Islamic Cairo, and then move north to Sharia Al-Azhar, and this is where we're going to take the bus. Now, this street is, Sharia Muhammad Ali, we're going to walk up this stretch only. This is one of the earliest examples of streets that were created for carriages and horse-driven carriages in Cairo. Now, the French, when they came to Egypt in the late 18th century, they tried to introduce they wanted one straight street in Cairo. Just one straight street. And what they worked on was Sharia al-Mosque, which you wouldn't be able to see here. Yeah. Which would have been here somewhere, Al-Mosque Street, which those of you who come to Khan Khalili know it. They started working on it, they never finished it, but this idea of a straight street that is not as narrow was very intriguing. Now, Muhammad Ali, yesterday Khalid was talking about how the narrative of westernization comes with Khidewi Ismail, but actually this was a phenomenon that happened way earlier. So as we can see, it starts with the French, who introduced a number of very Western urban policies in Egypt. The straight street, trying to prevent burial inside the city, coffee shops with men and women, oh my God. So these were things that the first balloon that the Egyptians saw, and these were all remarked on by the historians. The period of the French, and it's not an expedition, it is an invasion of Egypt, was very short. And immediately after comes Muhammad Ali, who gains semi-autonomous, becomes like a semi-autonomous ruler of Egypt. And he decides to, where is it? Establish a new palace for himself in Shobra, over here somewhere. So actually, this street is like a Darb al-Ahmar, but later. Again, it's a new attempt to create a direct connection between an old center of rule and the residence of the new ruler. And it's created. It is a straight street. It's wide enough to accommodate carriages which did not exist in Egypt. Egyptians moved on donkeys or horses or maybe camels, not very common. And it had arcades, which is again a strange phenomenon for a street in Cairo. Arcades are known inside the mosques. You see those ugly 80s, 70s buildings over there? Now the original buildings were torn down, but the morphology of the arcades was kept. then you will see a later stage where even that is not respected. I don't know if we'll go far down enough to see one of the original buildings, but if we do, I will point them out. A couple of things to know about this street. First of all, it was famous for the dancers and the singers and for the sale of musical instruments. This is less and less common nowadays. Now it's more famous for the furniture. The workshops make furniture on both sides of the street, and they sell them on the street itself. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the person who was responsible who was in charge of actually opening up the street, Ali Mubarak. He was a civil engineer who studied in Paris. He was one of the first batch of Egyptians to go and study abroad. And he held a number of posts in the government. He was, I think, he was Minister of Public Works, he was Minister of Education, he was Minister of Endowments, he was, I think, Prime Minister at points. And he was very progressive, and he really believed he really believed in this new Western and modern Cairo. One of the most interesting decrees that he instigated was a very short-lived ban of mashrabiyas. Now, mashrabiyas are the turned wood, sort of cantilevered canopy windows that you see in Islamic Cairo, and they're very specific to Islamic Cairo. I'll point them out when we walk down the street. And he banned them because he believed that they were dusty and they were unhygienic. But I think also, I mean, this is a very poor argument. I think part of it is an aesthetic argument, and this is one of the things I had a problem with Khalid's argument that day. The one place I know of this because in my research on the cemetery, there is one street that leads to a really famous shrine, and they widened the street to accommodate a tramway at some point. And then the Comité de Conservation said, we can't build modern-looking buildings. They have to have mashrabiyas. So they actually had to get special permission from the government to allow for the construction of mashrabiyas. But as we can see, and people didn't really listen, they continued to build their own version of mashrabiyas, which is not as beautiful and intricate as the earlier example. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to walk down this street. This is the main spine of Islamic Cairo. It starts with Bab al-Futuh in the north. Here would be the original wall of Fatimid Cairo, where Bab Zuwayla is. And we are here. So we're going to walk all the way up to Shara al-Azhar, which is here. You don't see it on this map. I'll stop only at Bab Zuwayla just to point out where the original limits of the city do that. They did years of research on all the different buildings and the values and the whatever until they could convince the government to do that. In the rest of the city, it still exists, but now it's not respected, obviously. The other thing is, not just because of Khatt al-Tanzim, but for many reasons also related to the inheritance of a piece of property. It passes from 1 to 4 to 16 to 20 to whoever, to the point where it's in no one's best interest to take care of it. So the building continues to deteriorate until you only have the shops on the street level, because these are shops that are rented by people, and it's in their best interest to take care of it. So we have a very interesting situation in Islamic Cairo where some streets, actually the density of the population is extremely low, way lower than downtown and way lower than the new, than the Say Muhandisin or whatever, and not because of the high, the density, the built-up space is really high, but the people living they're very few because of this constant loss of the upper stories of the buildings, whether because of the Tanzim or because of the inheritance practice that we have. Of Fatimid Cairo, but I wanted to stop here because this for me is a really important development. This is an Ottoman development by a Mamluk prince, and it's the kind of work that we see by Mamluks after they stop ruling the country. Now, 1517, the Ottomans invade Egypt, and the Mamluks still exist, but they're relegated to sort of, if they're powerful enough, de facto rulers, otherwise they are like the second in command. When this happens, they start to develop areas of influence in their neighborhoods. So suddenly there's a shift between the need to build close to the citadel, where everybody is there because this is like the upper class neighborhood and this is an indication of power, etc., to the need to develop So you take your tomb and you build it in the cemetery, or you build it somewhere along a main street. Suddenly there's a need to develop the area around your home, because this is where your area, your circle of influence increases. And this is what Radwan Bey did. This is a commercial establishment. It has, as you can see, shops. It has residential spaces on either side. It has a maq'ad, etc., etc. It's also covered. And it was always traditionally related to the idea of cloth and also leather at the same time. Yes, and tent makers, exactly. Now we're going through, and we'll see Bab Zubayla in front of us. I wanted to stop so that you just take note of the view as you're walking down. I want to say here, you are outside the Fatimid city of Cairo. That mosque that you see on your whatever over there, this is a Fatimid mosque that was built in the cemetery. Originally, this was a cemetery to house the head of the grandson of the Prophet, which was considered an important relic. So this is a vizier, a minister of the Fatimid Caliph. He knew that the head of the Prophet was coming from the Levant in Syria. He built this mosque as a shrine to put not the head of the Prophet, the head of the grandson of the Prophet, Hussein. But then the Caliph said, we're not going to put it here, we will put it in our cemetery, which is in Khan al-Khalili further north, and this is where the huge mosque of Al-Hussein is today. This is one thing. The second thing is the building on the right over there. This is another one of those buildings that were dismantled and stepped back in order to make the street wider. So another example, this was standard practice, and there's another building further down. The third thing, this is Bab Zubayla. This is the southern gate of Cairo, built at the end of the 11th century. This is one of the buildings that I have worked on. I was assistant director of the project, and I'm not saying that, I'm saying that because I want to point out problems. Things that we did, that I think we did wrong, but we couldn't do otherwise, etc. The first thing, the gate and the fence. Again, we continue to work with this paradigm of the fence that protects the people. It's a useless fence, as you can see in places. It's starting to be torn down completely. But in truth, if you don't have it, people continue to encroach on the building. The problem is not with people touching the building. It's the problem such as, for example, in Eid, the tanneries come because it's when there's the traditional slaughter of the animals, and all the hides are put on the building and under the building. So this is like, and they put salt on the leather. So this is a serious problem. Cars, because up till now cars come through this building. So if we don't have this fence, that means we would have accidents every so often where cars hit against the building, etc. But it's useless. It's a useless exercise. It's sort of like half-assed. But what the hell can we do? The second issue, I want to point those out. You see those ventilation things? These were made because we wanted to ventilate. We wanted to create a trench around the building to ventilate. Now, when we first did them, we put nice, cute, sort of chic covers out of a copper. 2 days later, they were stolen, obviously. So that was another lesson learned. The third thing is the basalt floor, the basalt street. We introduced the basalt, and we reintroduced basalt in this area. We started digging because we wanted to do something with the street. We found the remains of the old basalt cobblestones. At the time, they were removing the metro lines. They were doing sewage work in the street outside Sharah Port Said. And so they were finding a lot of basalt. We would go and pick them up, and we would hoard them until we had enough basalt to work on this area. Our idea was that because it's basalt, when people remove them, the cobblestones, to do any major restoration works or repairs, they could put them back in again. Obviously, not true. Final story, the story of the doors. The doors, we did excavations, the original shoe of the door, the pivot and the mufassala, I don't know, the system of the doors itself with ball bearings, by the way. We found some 1.5 meters below ground. Now, the system itself, this is the oldest example in the world that we know of the use of ball bearings, and we discovered them. We didn't know that this was the case. We had a problem. Now, standard solution would have been to dig down, to keep the excavation, and to show the original level of the doors themselves. If you do that, it's going to be a second garbage collection point. We took a really difficult decision of cutting the doors and introducing the new pivot, not using the old pivots because they were not in working order. We created new pivots out of stainless steel, and we put them on the street level, and we restored the door so that it opens and closes. The parts that closes, the parts that we cut are on display upstairs on the gates themselves. Now, I think it was the only thing we could have done, and we had high hopes of the door continuing to be opened and closed. Obviously, if there is no need for a door to be opened and closed, it will not be opened and closed. But we do have that wonderful memory of the first time we closed the door in like hundreds of years. And we have the memory of who was inside and who was outside, and you know, like that whole experience. And we continued to open and close it for a while. To be honest, by the time the conservation project was done, this door was already not working because of settlement, etc. They're very heavy doors. But it was quite an operation, yeah. The shops are still here, but the facades are totally different from what we introduced. Again, most probably because it did not suit the taste of the people who we had done this for. I think I'll stop here. That's enough. Part of a project in the 90s to develop this street. Now this is another street that cuts through Islamic Cairo. And it was always a very controversial street in the sense that it really comes smack in the middle of the city and cuts through it and breaks continuity completely. So for a long time people had problems with this bridge, and there was a project to introduce a tunnel under the street and start to slowly reconnect the two sides of the city. After the tunnel was dug, and thank you. And we were all worried about the effect of digging the tunnel, but actually they worked very well, so there was no problem. There was a big fight between the governor and the Minister of Culture, and the bridge was not removed. Now, some people say this is because of the shop owners, because they did not want the street to be pedestrianized, because over there's the major wholesale market for fabrics and textiles. Others say it's because it would have produced a really big square in front of Al-Hussein Street, and this feeds into into Shahid's point about trying to prevent the appearance of big squares where people can gather. But in all cases, it was not a very practical project, because it would have pedestrianized this whole area from here all the way down to there. Very sunny area, and what would you do? Just walk in the sun for a kilometer just to walk across? And the plan was this huge square with no shade, with no nothing. It was very strange. The bridge has an interesting story. This is a pedestrian bridge that was removed last year because of an accident, I think. And suddenly, 2 weeks ago, there was this big fuss about how the bridge has been stolen.
The guy is like an ex-US military guy who's not even a journalist. He sounds like he just wanted to have a second career. He's walking around Cairo creating all these bullshit stories.
Really? I didn't know who said
Check
that.
all of his stories. I don't know, I forgot his name, Andrew Jackson or something crazy.
Oh my.
Some typical name. But everything he's written about Cairo has nothing to do with anything real. Nothing.
Wow.
Including
I have to check him
being
out.
Stolen. Of course, he writes it like a year after the whole thing. So don't believe
خبط في
everything
حاجة حاجة خبطته فبقى unsafe، وهو كان unsafe لسنين فشالوه عشان الناس ما تمشيش عليه. فجأة سرقوا الكوبري عارفة كده يعني. طيب we don't know where the bus is, so we're finding out. I don't know, I thought they arranged. No, we're not walking all the way to Azhar Park. In front of Azhar Mosque. Okay, let's walk down there. But Beth is finding out.